thank you so much. Yeah, it's really fantastic to be able to be here and give a talk for the University of Oxford Psychedelic Society. I'm really excited, and so yeah, hope you guys find it interesting, full, stimulating, and maybe we can have a good chat at the end if I don't wangle on too much about something that I'm known to wangle on a lot about. So I'll just share my screen for you. Oh, it's already being shared, is it? Nice, yeah, cool. So there we are, and let's go. Well, actually, is there a way to, oh, I've minimized that now, okay, great. So, yeah, so my PhD is essentially a comparative phenomenological analysis of the DMT and near-death experience. Trying to kind of determine in what way DMT could simulate different dimensions of the near-death experience and what the implications of that could be, for the origins of the experience as well. So yes, without further ado, let's sort of get cracking. So the DMT experience, what is it like to be not a bat but on DMT? So let's think about the phenomenological cartography or the kind of experiential topography, as it were. So DMT, it's a very potent psychedelic tryptamine, and it's sort of said to be ubiquitous in nature and is indeed endogenous, right, to the human body, found in the human brain as well. And lots of you may be familiar with it in terms of it being the kind of main active constituent of ayahuasca, the Amazonian shamanic brew, translating as vine of the dead or vine of souls. So the following are some kind of major publications in the phenomenology of DMT kind of thus far, since its kind of inception to kind of sort of present day. I'm not going to read kind of all of them off there. You kind of have a little perusal. But they're all kind of, really in essence finding very similar things, just with kind of increasing sophistication and sort of nuances. So the first one there is Sai Halas and Zara in '58, and they were the very first study to administer DMT to humans. And they kind of looked at things in a more kind of psychiatric sense, so kind of the phenomenology sort of in more kind of symptomatic terms. And then you've got Rick Strassman in the '90s. So a lot of you might be familiar with his book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, 2001. And he kind of kicked off really the kind of new wave, as it were, the renaissance of psychedelic research till now. And it's really gaining such incredible traction. So his kind of phenomenology, a lot of it, it was really derived from his bedside notes after having, interaction with the participants afterwards. And then kind of predicating his book on those. And then we have Thematic Analysis, 2008. So I've conducted my own thematic analysis and we'll be showing you a lot of that. But this was the only other one done thus far. And it's limited in quite a few ways. And so hopefully mine, will be sort of a substantial improvement on that. And then we got Timmerman, Chris Timmerman, Imperial, 2018, releasing the paper DMT Models the Near-Death Experience, right? So they're all kind of saying the sense of disembodiment, dissociation from the body, mystical type experiences, so, this reconfiguration in self, space, and time. But what makes DMT very unique versus other psychedelics is this reliable at normal doses elicitation of these profound experiences, this immersion into a different space, and the encounters with these kind of apparently otherly, beings. But all of these phenomena, crucially, can be said to be part of the near-death experience. So hence, Strassman, subtitling his book, the sort of biology of the near-death experience and mystical experience. And then in particular, Chris Timmerman with DMT modeling the NDE. And he applied the near-death experience scale to both DMT experiences and near-death experiences. And, but this sort of psychometric approach kind of has its drawbacks, and mainly it doesn't account for the kind of quality of the items kind of on the scale, sort of how the content is emerging. So that's something that we'll look at a lot. So the near-death experience, maybe some of you aren't as familiar with the near-death experience, also called NDE. So what's it like to be dead? So the NDEs can be thought of as the following, you can have this experience by being clinically dead, albeit obviously temporarily, or sort of in critical condition, physical distress, and that could be fatal or otherwise, or even simply thinking that you might die, so the so-called brilliantly kind of termed fear death experience. But also different conditions, biological conditions, like meditation techniques, dreaming, and of course drugs like DMT, which is the topic of tonight. Right, they can induce the same kind of set of phenomenological features. So the kind of, in terms of the original studies of near-death experiences, Moody coined, well, allegedly, as we'll see, coined the near-death experience in his book Life After Life, and he delineated these kind of 15 core features. So here, just to sort of as proof, I couldn't quite believe it myself when I sort of started my PhD. This is from that original DMT paper from Sai-Halas in 58. And these are the kind of domains of experiences which he found from DMT. And near-death experiences, you can see here, is right here, even hyphenated, just like it normally is now. So, it's very pertinent that from the very first DMT study, near-death experience was there, was understood to be a phenomenon which can emerge from it. But what's also interesting on top of that is that actually comparatively, it's quite low down. It's actually, I think it was about 20% of participants actually that constituted, right, in terms of frequency. Yeah, there you go. So interesting. Ring, so Kenneth Ring, he made this kind of 5-stage continuum. He was the first scale to assess the NDE, and he kind of suggested this progression from peace to having an out-body experience, space of darkness, and then growing toward like a light, and then entering into kind of another world. And he suggested that fewer and fewer people get to those last stages, so it's like increasing depth. Bruce Grayson then didn't really like this scale, so he made a new one just a few years later, and that's the one that Chris applied to his experiences. We applied to our experiences as well. So Charlene Verville is a fascinating study. They applied the near-death experience scale to people who had actual sort of coma-related NDEs, and then NDEs induced by these kind of conditions like meditating, drugs, etc., and which they refer to as NDE-like NDEs. And they actually found that they were essentially identical in terms of that analysis of the scale, right? So you don't need to be dead or even think that you're dying in order to have the phenomenological syndrome. And then in terms of temporal sequence, in order to kind of test Ring's idea, they found this same group actually found that there wasn't really a reliably produced temporal sequence, but there was, in a small minority, a kind of very approximate general order of like having this experience of peace, and then sensation of light, and then followed by encountering spirits, and then finally the return, which might end up as like this sort of sense of coming to a border. So it's a bit different, quite a lot different from Ring's actually. So this one is the only thematic analysis, again from that same research group actually, of the near-death experience so far, and they did this in 34 cardiac arrest survivors, and they found these sort of 11 themes. And so again, you can kind of have a look at them there, kind of in decreasing order of frequency, and none of it really is new, is novel from the past kind of decades of literature. However, one sort of small thing to take away from that is interesting in terms of Ring thinking originally that fewer people, end up at these later stages of like seeing the light or entering the other world. Whereas they found that half of people ended up in these kind of other worlds, and the majority, most of the people actually did encounter this kind of light. All right. So the quest for the NDE-ogen, that kind of potential endogenous compound which could elicit, engender the near-death experience. So you can think about this, these relationship with these endogenous compounds and the near-death experience in terms of like simulation. Like these compounds simulate the experience, or contribution, are these compounds actually in the body which are genuinely, involved, implicated in the NDE, right? So let's think about simulation and obviously focus on DMT. So let's think about the dimethyltryptamine as I've coined it, not necessarily pejoratively, but it's not fully known yet, hence the inquiry. So obviously, like I said, Rick Strassman publishing DMT, the spirit molecule, the idea really that DMT is like this chemico-psychopomp, which, wherein the soul sort of alights on its hydrocarbon backbone and sort of flurries into the after realm, that this compound could potentially have the capacity to do such a thing, but based on his phenomenology of his participants having a lot of resonances with the near-death experience. And so we can kind of see increasing sophistication of looking at the actual comparison with as you go forward. So Potts sort of it's still crude looking at the Grayson scale, and also made a short list of themes from Strassman's book, and he basically kind of poo-pooed the DMT hypothesis of the NDE, right? Not enough overlap to suggest that DMT has anything to do with it. And then later, a bit, a better study looking at Benny Shannon's Antipodes of the Mind, looking at all the really rich formulation of the ayahuasca phenomenology in which DMT is a main component, and comparing that to sort of celebrity, sort of NDEs, really, to be honest, and also Moody. And he basically found that, overwhelmingly similar. DMT could certainly have something to do with the NDE, but there's some obvious differences, like with ayahuasca, you don't get this kind of out-body experience where you're looking at yourself from above, and with the NDE, you don't get like this rich array of kind of these, psychedelic fractal geometries, right? And then, like I said, Timmerman publishing DMT models and near-death experience, very rigorous way of looking at this psychometrically, and he found ultimately that the different items, and we'll look at this in more detail, but the different items of the scale didn't differ significantly between the DMT experience and the NDE experience, right? So, someone on DMT will be equally as likely to kind of meet other beings as someone in a near-death experience, or have this sense of separation from their body, etc. This fantastic paper by Marshall, a neurolinguistic programming paper. I always say that, a natural language processing paper, where they basically looked at 15,000 reports, drug reports from Erowid, from 165 different drugs, and compared them to like 625 near-death reports. Okay, so you can see that here you got the similarity to the near-death experience, right, on the y-axis, and then you got all these different substances, right, and then you kind of zoomed in here, and these are the substances which are the most like the near-death experience, right, and you can see that ketamine is actually kind of quite a bit higher. So maybe you wish that I was, or imagine that you'd be seeing DMT up there, but DMT's here. So ketamine, and then salvia divinorum, and then kind of followed by this trail of psychedelics. You got these psychedelics in purple, which are basically acting upon the serotonin system, and then you've also got some phenethylamines, which are also acting on noradrenaline and dopamine as well, and you've also got in the yellow like these ketamine-like dissociative chemicals, right? So these are essentially on par, right? So they're the serotonergic classic psychedelics. So you could think in terms of the simulation idea that DMT, there's a similar metaphor that you could think of. So in terms of sort of psychosis, schizophrenia, DMT as an endogenous psychedelic fueled this idea of DMT being the schizotoxin, right? And there's this higher levels in people with schizophrenia, but they didn't find that. It was a kind of a bit of a red herring. So the idea that the DMT experience and the sort of psychosis experience were similar. So DMT just simulated some of the aspects and therefore kind of got considered a psychotomimetic instead, right? And it's much more complicated than that, in the very same way that, you know, it could be that DMT isn't responsible for the near-death experience and only simulates a lot of aspects of it. And so it's not actually biologically contributing to the NDE, theoretically. But then there's some more complicated data to think about this idea. So here is another fantastic study. So this was Lee, 2015, writing that asphyxia induces a neurotransmitter brainstorm, right? So with experimental sort of induction of death in rats and rodent models, they found that noradrenaline increased by about 30%, not 30%, sorry, 30 times of the baseline values, right, after like the first couple of minutes after post-death. Serotonin about 20 times, dopamine about 12 times. So these are the ones which non-classical and classical psychedelics act on. And then glutamate as well increased significantly, and that's what, and ketamine increases cortical glutamate as well, right? So we can see that here. And so these are all these compounds, which endogenous compounds, which are being massively upregulated after death, right? So you got serotonin here, there you go. And you can see that the change, right, from baseline fold, even up to about 6 minutes, it's actually like 250 times the original baseline value. Is absolutely astonishing. And then you got dopamine and noradrenaline, the other monoame there, increasing. Dean et al., another wonderful, amazing study, just last year, finding several really interesting things, right? That the enzymes necessary, AADC and INMT, are co-localized co-localized together, right, in the brain, in the cortical tissue, right? Those are the enzymes which are necessary for DMT synthesis. It's thought to be in the peripheries and then sort of shuttled into the brain, but they found good evidence that it was actually synthesized in the brain. And it was at major neurotransmitter levels, same levels as the canonical neurotransmitters like serotonin. Also, that upon this same kind of experimental rat death, DMT spikes, right, at about sort of 6 times. So we can see that here. So this baseline levels of DMT, and then after cardiac arrest, there's these really significant, highly significant increases, right, up to about 6 times. And that's regardless of the pineal gland. So you know, sort of Strassman's original idea, you know, the idea that the pineal gland releases DMT, and it still may well, you know, it's still found to have the necessary enzymes, and it might do that, but it's not actually necessary, because at least from this data, right? There's one thing to say about that first, though, is that there's a very interesting rebuttal to that by Nichols and Nichols, found you're sort of suggesting that given that DMT only increased by about 6 times, and serotonin like increases just inordinately, as well as the fact that serotonin has a much higher affinity for the serotonin receptor, the 5-HT2A receptor, upon which, you know, presumably all these near-death like psychedelic effects act upon, versus DMT. So because serotonin obviously evolved with the serotonin receptor, so it's better at binding that receptor versus DMT. So those things combined makes DMT have a very like limited role. And perhaps serotonin, you know, this is a really interesting point. Serotonin may well be a better candidate for the kind of NDE-ogen, because it is actually psychedelic. There's some evidence to suggest, you know, people don't necessarily think that, but some evidence suggesting that high level serotonin is psychedelic because it induces the mouse head twitch response, or what Tobias Buchborn calls the psychedelic signature move, right, indicating that it's psychedelic. But why would this stuff be released, right? So there's lots of evidence being accrued recently of DMT, LSD, psilocybin being highly neuroprotective and anti-inflammatory and neurogenic, right? And these are kind of properties that you'd want in an organism for evolution to have evolved. So at the point of severe stress or threat of the organism, then it has these sort of mitigating sort of defense functions, right, to save the organism. But I think, you know, this paper by Lee, you know, it's a really interesting one. It's kind of a different question, I think, because it's a vast array of coordinated neurotransmitter system, sort of suggesting this sort of death program, as it were. And they write in that paper about this corticocardiac signaling system, very, very complex, sophisticated system, which sort of seems to like try to save the organism initially upon this kind of cardiac arrest, and then realizing it's sort of useless, it kind of then accelerates cardiac arrest, fascinatingly. So there's this sort of very embedded evolutionary kind of program potentially. So this has psychological advantages, you know, as well, like this dissociation, painlessness. In the case of humans, perhaps the life review being the sort of attempt of the brain to kind of find the recesses of the mind some kind of information to save itself. But, you know, the question you keep on coming back to is why it can have those qualities, but why is it so unbelievably otherworldly and transcendent? And obviously, literal interpretations of that, survivalist interpretations, would be because that's actually what's happening, right? That's what it's doing that because that's what's going on. So this can bring us to the idea of, you know, away from the dying brain paradox, the idea that the NDE is this vivid, like hyper real, coherent experience. How can it be happening when the brain is malfunctioning? So we're moving from that back to the idea of the dying brain hypothesis, but it's not the dying brain hypothesis, you know, that's paradoxical because the brain is just kind of turning to mush or it's silent. But we're now seeing this kind of new turning of the kind of cognitive biology of death, that it's really hyperfunctional actually. Right, it's kind of firing on all cylinders. So anyway, let's start looking at the actual sort of study where I kind of derived most of my data. So that was all the background. Sorry, just bear with me here. Yeah, so all previous kind of work has been in lab settings, right? So we instead, sort of study that Dave Luke ran and I became a PhD student on, we rocked up to our recruited DMT users' homes as they're kind of about to have their breakthrough DMT experience. And they provided their own DMT. We measured it out carefully, and it seemed to be about 55 milligrams. That was the average, about 55 milligrams. And prior lab studies, the maximum is actually, in Chris Timmerman's case, it's actually 20 milligrams, but only in 13 participants, and only a few of them actually got the highest dose, right? So it is definitely going to be more, but because in smoking it's not as bioavailable, it won't be kind of as much more as it might look. So all the participants were healthy, sort of seasoned DMT psychonauts, mostly male, mostly European, okay, but kind of good span of ages. And so there were more participants overall, but for the qualitative analysis, that's 36 interviews with 31 participants. So the most important things about the study is that it was, novel things about the study is that it's a discrete data set. We carried out semi-structured interviews, and that was directly after the DMT trip. And we used what's called microphenomenology. So that is sort of rehearsing the experience chronologically, spanning all different domains of experience, real attention to detail, and most importantly, avoiding bracketing. So asking them to say everything in their own words, to avoid really like the propagation of memes, really like, I saw an alien, but what, you may have, what did it look like? What was alien about it? How was it interacting with you? That kind of stuff, So I also quantitatively tallied how many of the interviews particular features were in, but the most part of it is this qualitative thematic analysis. And today I'm just going to look at the kind of near-death experience component of that. But first of all, let's look at the quantitative bit, the scales, right? And specifically the near-death experience scale. So this is DMT models the near-death experience from Chris Timmerman's paper, but what I've done is I've superimposed our own results on that. So you can see. So first of all, this is the scale. So these are all the items, right, from 16 items from the Grayson scale, and then you got the score of each of the item, right? Dark blue is DMT field study, grey is the lab study, imperial, and then the orange is actual authentic near-death experiences. Okay, so yeah, so I've mentioned some important differences which might account for the differences in scores that we find. We had like over double the participants the lab study had, it was substantially higher dose, and it was a field study instead of a lab study. So our data shows that actually most of the features actually scored higher, and overall we kind of scored higher as well versus the lab study. So you can sort of see that here actually, and this is the sort of subscale analysis of the near-death experience scale. Unfortunately, the colors have switched, which is a bit annoying, but this is the lab study, and then the gray is our own study, the field study, and then this is the near-death experience. So it conforms kind of much closer to that. So yeah, so as I said, Timmerman found that there was no significant difference between DMT, lab IV DMT, and the near-death experience. But I think you can see in this kind of bottom cluster that evidently there are some near-death experience features which are much higher in actual near-death experiences compared to DMT. And I think one kind of potential difference between the states is if we look at the kind of dead persons here, which is quite a bit less than what Chris Timmerman found in his study, and that makes it much more dissimilar to the near-death experience, right? So it could potentially be that near-death experience is DMT is sort of less prone to inducing this particular phenomenon, right? So let's look at the actual qualitative analysis. So this is perhaps my favorite slide. So this is, I thought it'd be a bit more interesting than just drawing up a table, which would look pretty boring. So this is all my different themes, kind of overarching themes and sub themes, which I've sort of developed from looking at all of our interview data. Right. Unfortunately, my screen's sort of going a bit orange because I forgot about the night light, so I can't really see some of the words here. But that would mean that you can't either, doesn't it? Which is a bit annoying. So do you mind if I just actually pause for a second and change the night light, because it might be better for you? Is that right? I'm going to take that as a yes.
Yeah, that's all good. Go for it.
Okay, sorry about that, guys.
The screen's fine for us though. When you're screen sharing, the screen's fine for us, but for your own sake, go for it.
Oh yeah, of course. Oh, because it's just a hardware thing. Okay, cool. I'm still going to change it though, because it is so annoying. I totally forgot about that. But very important. If you guys don't have a night light on, I highly suggest putting a night light on. Good for your sleep. All right. Resume share. Let's go. Cool. So DMT thematic analysis. So yes, pretty cool that I managed to get it all onto a DMT molecule. If you didn't notice that, that's a DMT molecule. So yeah, you got all these different experiences in sort of the sense of self, really, and then you get this kind of sense of the other, the encounter with the other. So immersion into these other worlds, and then encounters with these other beings, right? But what we're going to do is we're going to just focus on the near-death experience for now, okay? So this is just the kind of frequency analysis. So these are all the themes. So you can see my themes here. This is the DMT thematic analysis and some of the themes. And then you got the near-death experience thematic analysis, that same one that Pascal did that I mentioned. So this is Pascal's paper here. So I want to thank the Coma Science Group for actually sharing with me the actual raw qualitative data that I could work with for that. And I'll be showing you some of that as well momentarily. So this is a further kind of quantitative comparison, right, just before we get into the qualitative. So I'm just not going to go through all of it, obviously, but just look at kind of sort of a select overarching themes, ones which aren't on the near-death experience scale at all, or ones which actually show different results to that which Chris Timmerman kind of suggested. So let's look at this sense of the encounter, right, the encounter here. So mystical beings on the near-death experience scale, it looked actually that, like DMT, our field study data suggested that it was quite different to the near-death experience, and that DMT was really good at engendering this kind of experience. So in the near-death experience, you see that about 44% had an encounter, but in our study, actually, essentially 100% of people had some encounter of some nature. In near-death experience, you see what they called imaginary creatures, or imaginary beings, rather, that weren't humans, weren't animals, you know, and that was about 12%, approximately. And then in ours, it was actually the most of them. It was about 3/4 of these sort of otherly kind of creature-like beings. Being of light, so that's like kind of the light, being of light. So, you know, this kind of classic sort of entity in near-death experiences, exuding light, love, wisdom, you know, so that was kind of comparable in terms of frequency. But as we're going to look at in the qualitative analysis, the content, right, and in this case, the kind of physical appearance of it is actually markedly different. And this is a crucial principle that we're going to revisit, right? Or what about like the opposite, like these kind of scary demonic type beings? Again, quite comparable in terms of the frequency, but yeah, so but it was still a quite small minority, and that could be because, you know, DMT in the field study was very optimal settings, you know, notorious, but in near-death experience, it's kind of notoriously underreported. So about 14% in recent analyses kind of suggested that there's sort of these distressing near-death experiences. In terms of the human being, like if they're, you know, humans being encountered or deceased relatives, in the near-death experience, you see about 33% of the 44% encounters overall are these deceased spirits, and they're all family and friends, and they're all dead, essentially all dead. But compared to DMT, where the great minority, actually 17% of the overall 100% of the encounters are human, and only a couple of them are family and friends, and it's only those who are actually dead, right? So I think in the interest of time, I think you got the idea of this kind of frequency comparison that you can make, and the frequencies can be the same, but the content of it can actually be quite markedly different. So let's kind of zoom through that, and if you want to ask me anything about that later, you absolutely can. So this is the qualitative analysis now. So let's look at the kind of content comparison itself. So this is the actual near-death experience theme that I kind of constructed, and so all things relating to sort of death and birth. The typical here, the kind of typical NDE features refers to kind of previously established features and themes of the near-death experience. So let's again just look at a subset, but a subset of scenarios that's actually closely mirror the traditional NDE literature in terms of how NDEs actually present themselves in terms of actual content. So I'm not going to read them all out, but they're there for your kind of perusal. So let's sort of look at this one, for instance. So RH here, one of our participants says that, well, he says, it reports this classic experience of like the void, which is a subset of sort of so-called distressing near-death experiences. And that he was also associated with the feeling of dying, right? NN, here, if we kind of skip through here, here's an experience, one of two subjects referring to seeing themselves in the form of a kind of etheric or energy body, and that's something which near-death experiences report as well. SW, he also encompasses a kind of dying-like sensation, and also this reanimation of his life, which is a major feature of NDEs, and a projection of himself into the perspective of others, which was called sort of empathic resonance by the sort of writer and near-death experience writer as well, David Lorimer, right, which I've kind of called sort of hyper-empathy here. So ultimately, evidently there is a small subcluster which do exhibit features which are actually presenting as they do in near-death experiences. So, for instance, in Strassman's chapter "Contact Beyond the Veil," he outlined he focused on two participants with very, very NDE-like experiences, but it was a minority, right? It's 2 out of 60 essentially. And so Stephen Zara, again, this is from the very first study that I mentioned in 1958. So this is an example, a quote from their study, which again is very NDE-like. So they say, "I hear a whistling. I'm en route somewhere, but where? This is death. I have arrived, and in front of me are two quiet, sunlit gods. They're welcoming me into this new world. But again, if you remember, this might be NDE-like, but in the graph that I showed you at the beginning, it was still a minority of them that actually had these kind of experiences. And most of the DMT analysis NDE relating themes had what I've kind of called in previous presentations the DMT filter kind of turned on, right? So just to recapitulate that kind of core idea, DMT models or simulates the structure, or what you could think of as like the template or the blueprint of the near-death experience, but it fails to simulate the vast variety of that template's kind of different manifestations. What is the specific content of each of them, and that you could think of as texturing, right? So this is a brilliant example by Alan Watts, and this is describing his first DMT trip. And he says it's like being fired out the muzzle of an atomic cannon with neon Byzantine barreling, right? So he's kind of describing the tunnel phenomenon of near-death experience, but it's with this idiosyncratically like DMT-ish finesse, right? So let's actually turn to other NDE themes of the DMT analysis, which are like this, which are not so conforming to this kind of classic NDE manifestation. So I'll kind of go through them, and we're going to compare kind of just a few of them, and we'll compare side by side a quote from the DMT analysis and one from Cassol's NDE analysis, and hopefully you'll see what I mean by this kind of content contrast. Okay, so what about the out-of-body experience? So this is from one patient of the Cassol qualitative analysis and NDE. So I'm actually going to read these. So he says, there is the anaesthetist, my treating physician, a surgeon, the teacher, nurses, a lady who is not very active at the moment and speaks a lot. In a vulgar voice, she says what seems to me is nonsense about the situation everyone's going through. Some laugh, others are unmoved. My GP is rather serious. In fact, they just lost me. Oh yes, I forgot to tell you, for quite some time I've been in my cloud and watching all this little world that's busy around my body. So earlier he actually referred to being in an out-body state and finding himself like in an etheric cloud state. I feel calm and peaceful, but the words I perceive hurt me. I see through the bodies of my own body in its entirety gutted. I see myself open in two, exposed there in blinding white and raw light. Right? So let's think about that, and then let's compare that to a participant of ours, DMT experiencer MB. So what she says is, I was a very compact point of consciousness. I definitely wasn't aware of like a human body or something. It was definitely not like an OBE, right? Definitely not. I can't necessarily say if I was returning or ever exited my body. I never at any point felt like I'd left my body. So never at any point felt like I moved from here. So in the kind of left here, so first of all, like fascinatingly, 9 out of the 11 NDE-OBEs from the Cassol paper contain these kind of potentially veridical kind of elements. So in that you get, so in the NDEs you get like this classic out-body state where you're kind of viewing yourself from above. And then with DMT, I mean, to be honest, the vast majority of our experiences had a total dissolution of their body experience, right? They didn't get that out-of-body state, as from the horse's mouth here. This is a bit atypical because she says that they didn't get a sense of movement, whereas, you know, quite a few of our participants did say that they had this sort of sense of propulsion elsewhere. But they have this lack of sense of the body and immersion into this other world. Again, just in the interest of time, I think I'm just going to skip through that one, but we can go back to it if you like. So the being of light, this is one of my favorite ones to compare. So what this particular NDE patient says is the following. A gigantic white, totally white guy, whiteness itself, resplendent with almost white light alone, a being of light, no, whiteness. He is so surrounded and drowned in white that his face has no color. He is very imposing, like Barry White, huge, strong. He wears a long white beard, long white hair. Doesn't seem aggressive or unsympathetic. he rather gives a reassuring and benevolent impression. Obviously, he's directing something. He knows me from my case and my record. I think I can see an expression of kindness on his white paternal face, right? So let's think about that one, and then let's sort of pass the buck over to the DMT experience, right? So RH here, in his second trip with us, he says the following about another entity which he's encountering. Extraordinarily beautiful. I don't know if I cried, but the intensity of it was just amazing. The feeling of love. We definitely knew each other. Extraordinary intelligence, the most profound sense of love. He knows. It's incredibly beautiful and I'm familiar with it. It's so massively intelligent, I'm struggling to find words, right? So, but then he goes on to describe the kind of physical appearance of what it actually looked like to him. Tentacled, right? Imagining of what synapses look like, synaptic nerves or something a bit octopusy. Certainly had quite a lot of things reaching out all over the place, right? So you got this kind of classic light being presentation. It's magnificent, benevolent, super intelligent. You know, on the left here, what the near-death experiencer is describing, but then they also describe it as emanating this white light, and also the sort of sense of being sent back, right, and sort of serving this function. Same with RH. You know, he says that it's beautiful, loving sense of hyperintelligence, but then he describes it as an octopoid synapse, right? So content differences. So this is a really interesting one, and I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts about it at the end. So Carol Zaleski in '89 wrote Otherworld Journeys, right? So she was comparing medieval near-death experiences to modern contemporary near-death experiences. And one really interesting observation she made is in the kind of domain of the life review. And she says that in medieval times, you know, everything's sort of determined by the sort of church kind of cultural zeitgeist, and it was all judgmental, fire and brimstone, hell-like, you know, attacked by demons. But then over the years, there was this sort of development towards this rehabilitative and kind of educational kind of life review, to, you know, toward this kind of existential onus on values of free will and responsibility and doing positive deeds, right? And I think that's quite well emulated in this following NDE. So let's have a look at this. So he says, they showed me passages from my life, from my childhood to present age, projecting the scenes in front of me on a kind of table. Felt like a bit like a view from above, as if looking at a model. I saw the company where I worked, its roofs, the trucks coming in and out, but they showed me a lot more negative than positive scenes. Each time they pointed out to me my mistakes, my bad decisions, suddenly they destroyed the model. They seemed to mean, did you see him? Are you referring to the person? Well, you won't see him again, right? It was unbearable, like a judgment, but with the punishment of having my life swept away with every mistake I'd made. It's hard to explain, but I felt the consequences of my bad decisions very strongly, right? Really, I love that near-death experience. So this is kind of versus our participant, MT. It's not really a life review per se, but let's kind of have a look at what she says. So this is, yeah. So she says, it just felt so playful. I was thinking, what's the message? And she was like, don't be stupid. There's no message. So this is the sort of entity encounter that she's having. I just couldn't stop laughing. She was just like, it's just a fucking game. Just play with it. It's an infinite game and you can make up the rules. Just play the game. It's here to have fun. You can't win. You can't lose. Just play. I had these questions in the back of my mind and it was just going, it doesn't matter. Just be here now. And it felt really like it was Shakti putting on this performance for me. Isn't it fucking amazing? Like existence, just woo! It was beautiful, and the whole of life felt silly in a nice way. Not like, oh, it's silly or pointless. It was like, it's silly and that's it. Enjoy it. Life's a fair ride, a roller coaster, something to enjoy. Okay, so this sort of sense of evaluation of meaning and values in one's life, and it's sort of being communicated to her through this kind of flirtatious kind of female entity, inviting her to play. but it's potentially the kind of opposite message, really, communication, than this particular NDE experiencer. You know, this idea like the universe is yours to just do as you will and want. You know, there's no winning or losing. It's just a ride to enjoy. Could be a potentially like contentious sort of comparison that I'm making, but you know, it's a very interesting one. So it's sort of this general sense of a kind of moral versus an amoral sort of cosmology there, like certainly not immoral, but sort of a sense of kind of amorality. This one also a really interesting one. So I'd like for anyone at the end to kind of sink their teeth into with me. So I've coded this account, The Boy Who Cried Death, or Hacking Heaven, and the two kind of names of the same slide actually to kind of indicate that I can't really decide between all my puns and alliteration that I make. You know, like psyching the psychopomp, or faking out the ferryman. So let's sort of see what I mean by that by just reading it for you. So here the interviewer and NN are implying a kind of more transcendentalist or literal interpretation of this encounter experience, and you know, in the context of dying. So the interviewer kind of says, and were they specifically coming to check you out? They referring to the entities. And NN says, they were paying attention. I wouldn't say they were particularly interested, but were like, there's another one, kind of impersonating the entities. Yeah, basically, and they have a little laugh. Is he dead? Nah, it's just DMT. No, he's going back, just a flying visit. Yeah, they must get that a lot. All right, so yeah. so you know, a question is, why does taking DMT, potential substance released at death, look like the near-death experience, right? Obviously, you could just say because, well, it's the same substance which is being released, so why wouldn't it? But you know, they're insinuating that when one takes DMT, you may be, in essence, like hacking one element of the death program in our kind of neuro-spiritual system, potentially. So if you remember that paper by Lee and Dean, you know, showing all this massive upregulation of neurotransmitters at death, which includes DMT, right? So you're kind of hijacking one bit, your kind of DMT's role in the brain's sort of psychochemical swan song, right, at that kind of time of death, and perhaps in some way breaking through to a parallel space to which one actually might break through to in this sort of survivalist perspective in a near-death experience, right? And that's quite fantastically summed up by this excellent image. So, concluding remarks, a bit of a subliminal message there for you. So it's a kind of triangulation, really, of the kind of levels of analysis that you can look at this stuff from, like modes of approaching the DMT near-death experience issue. So sort of the neurobiological, that's there's this kind of neurochemical cornucopia which is being produced in the mammalian brain at death, which includes DMT. Then you've got the kind of quantitative, so the scales and the different frequency analyses which I showed you, and so the idea that they all the participants might qualify as DMT-ogen's near-death experiences, so they all possess sort of the basic structure, or what I refer to as like the template of the near-death experience. However, there's some features which are maybe less inducible by DMT. So like I said in that frequency analysis of the themes, like to see spirits are much less common in DMT, much more common in NDEs, or might be more inducible by DMT. And we didn't actually touch on that, but other worlds and this encounter, or we did certainly touch on the sort of a sense of encounter with these otherly beings is much more common in DMT versus near-death experience. And the qualitative dimension of looking at this. So almost all the specific content, or what I kind of refer to as like the texturing of each of these sort of features, is not typical of near-death experience, and actually is quite idiosyncratically like DMT-ified. However, there's a minority which might have like a small cluster of near-death experience typical content. So as I did kind of mention, RH is sort of limbo, void experience, and NN's kind of etheric body kind of experience. but none really consist of this fuller syndrome of such NDE typical content, which does constitute most near-death experiences. So yes, there's this, again, coming back to this idea of, instead of the NDE-ogen, like this idea of some kind of endogenous compound just releasing the near-death experience, that maybe DMT should be considered more an NDE mimetic. You know, in similar ways, what I said before, that the idea of DMT as a psychotogen later converted to the idea of psychotomimetic, right? So what about explanatory models? Like, kind of big whoop then, like what does all this mean potentially? So how might we potentially account for these structural similarities, which I've identified? And I don't think you necessarily need to invoke the release of endogenous DMT, because of this idea of, like, the broad features, phenomenological features, are actually likely elicitable by many converging mechanisms downstream. So just a kind of recent example of this, just literally like the other month, is the idea of salvia is a completely different compound, acts on a completely different receptor system, the kappa opioid receptor, as well as classical psychedelics, which are a different chemical class and act on a completely different receptor system, the 5-HT2A receptor. They still both converge on this downstream inhibition of the default mode network, which is a particular network of the brain, right? Which likely underwrites their very similar phenomenologies of like DMT and salvia, for instance, like this sort of shuttling to a different space in this kind of dissociative manner. However, saying that DMT itself could theoretically contribute to the content similarities, so not the similarities in structure, but similarities in content potentially. So those are the things that I already mentioned, the kind of very obvious similarities between DMT and near-death experience. So I just mentioned the kind of idea of this sort of void-like limbo space, or etheric body, or the life review potentially, just from the data that I've kind of presented so far. And what about the potential explanations for the content differences, right? So there could be psychological, top-down, as it were, mechanisms for that, like the idea that the context and expectation effects amidst this kind of scenario of dying in near-death experiences could account for these differences in content. And that's fascinating. If endogenous psychedelics were implicated in that, then that would actually be enhanced because of the idea of psychedelic setting, right? So yes, one example of this could be deceased spirits, albeit, as I don't think I did mention actually. So one kind of undermining idea of this is the idea of actually, I did mention that one part, that near-death experiences, like dreaming or meditation and stuff, were the same as actual near-death experiences, right? So, in those circumstances, you wouldn't have had this sort of expectation effects. And also a minority of, I think it was only 8 of the how many was it? The 34 of Cassel's NDE participants were actually aware that they were even dying. So again, undermines kind of potential expectation effects. A bottom-up or neurological explanation could be, and I think is a much better explanator for these sort of differences in actual content. The idea that it's actually a vastly more complex and elaborate situation going on in the brain of a dying person compared to just sort of deluging your brain with DMT when you just take it as a drug, right? This, what I mentioned about the brainstorm at death, and also this hypoxia, lack of oxygen in the brain, which then induces sort of sequelae of like temporal lobe epilepsy, which kind of releases sort of discharges in very sensitive areas like the hippocampus, temporal parietal junction, anterior insula, so that could account for particular content differences in things like the out-of-body experience, which is what I already sort of delineated for you, right? Instead of sort of going out of your body, which is what this TPJ inhibition might do, the temporal parietal junction, you kind of have this sort of total dissolution of your body and you're in another space. So very last slide, we got there in the end. If you're still with us, then congratulations. Thank you. So just ontological kind of considerations. So I'm not going to kind of read all these out, but there is a lot of documentation, a lot of anecdotal evidence and observational evidence, you know, of psi, of extrasensory perception during near-death experiences, right? And that can certainly, you know, really push the boundaries of the sort of materialistic reductionist perspective of what's going on with near-death experiences. Certainly be, you know, something non-local. And what about a comparative kind of religious approach to near-death experiences? So Gregory Shushan and Jeffrey Kripal are two comparative scholars, which I love and respect a lot. And Shushan has said in his 2009 study, Concepts of the Afterlife and Early Civilizations, he says, he essentially comes, so while I've compared an analysis of DMT and near-death experiences, he's compared NDEs across different ancient and indigenous cultures, right? And he comes to the same conclusion as me, and he says, Levi Strauss used the term myth themes to describe the thematic elements of a myth. Elements such as ascent, i.e. the out-body experience, or judgment, like the life review. These are myth themes. However, culture-specific details, which we may refer to simply as symbols, are expressed in myth themes, right? So the consistent kind of myth themes across conditions, what I refer to as like the structural template, Shushan kind of believes that it relates to this core sort of syndrome kind of can relate to an actual core or objective reality. But I think one thing that's interesting, he doesn't really ever discuss, actually I haven't got to the end of his last book, so maybe he does, but he doesn't discuss structuralism, which is actually something that Levi Strauss actually, you know, discussed a lot himself. You know, the idea that we're all having these same experiences which are consistent because we all have the same brain, right? But that's obviously a more of a kind of reductionist perspective. And application as well. So, are there better models? If I've kind of drawn holes in the sort of DMT thing in certain places, are there better models? And psilocin, which is the active metabolite of psilocybin, could be a better one at much higher doses. It's actually structurally closer to serotonin versus DMT. It's got this kind of hydroxyl group here, which serotonin does and DMT doesn't. And I just wrote a chapter for the Breaking Convention book on a case study of a very high dose psilocybin experience, which is remarkably near-death experience like. And so, you know, these better models, you know, can be used for existential distress in the terminally ill, you know, really administering something which is really near-death experience like, which could be really exceptionally salutatory and helpful for them. So Akin, Leibes in 2020 just did a follow-up study of a very long-term follow-up study of the psilocybin for end-stage cancer study. And so they were using psilocybin in that, but potentially, you know, maybe these very high doses, which are more near-death experience like, could be, you know, really even better in terms of therapeutic outcome. And I just wrote a mental health article actually about that particular follow-up study. So yeah, so I think that's it. Thank you, everyone. And I'd just like to thank my funders and the Coma Science Group for giving me their qualitative data, and supervisors, Maya, Simon, all our psychonauts, and enjoy these memes.
Amazing, I love the memes. That was super interesting. Thank you so much, Pascal. I really enjoyed that and appreciated the thorough weaving of all the different literature throughout, and that was beautifully comprehensive. We have a few questions, so I'm going to start with Gabrielle. I'm going to unmute you now, so you feel free to ask your question directly.
Okay, I'll just read out what I wrote because it was a bit of a stream of consciousness. So I was just thinking about, I guess, how it compares to our default brain, which is also, you know, it's completely wired. It's, you know, filters out all of this unnecessary sensory information, and psychedelics act to unleash that filter. You know, so we can protect ourselves from harm and evolutionary goals. But in order to not be overwhelmed, we kind of, you know, filter out a lot of sensory information. So I was wondering if that, with all of this stuff that we relegate to the subconscious of like breathing and surviving and everyday things, when we were actually in this kind of acute trauma situation, in near death, birth, you know, kind of like near hypoxia, all of that stuff, do we actually kind of reopen those subliminal processes that we've normally damped down? And is this actually representative of almost like a set switching? So we've got our kind of usual hypercognitive, let's act on the daily world, and go over to this like survival mode, which we don't normally need. And is DMT actually the kind of responsible for switching that into that mode in a similar way that adrenaline switches us over from, you know, our normal functioning over into a fight or flight mode?
Yeah, well, I think you've kind of answered your own question in a way. That was a very good, like, elaborate kind of question. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of threads to that, but yeah, I think I basically agree with you in that sense. Yeah, I mean, as to, you know, what is the switch? Like, certainly we're in a certain mode as we are. Like, it's really just phenomenal. And I'm recently sort of getting more and more sensitive to this idea, you know, that the default mode network, which kind of engenders our kind of default mode in the everyday, we're so in it, like we're so ensnared kind of in it. But obviously it's very, very functional and is obviously developed, you know, like it takes up 20% of our whole brain's kind of, you know, metabolic capacity. And so so it's obviously these really deep survival importance of being there. But then when we get to these very, very threatening situations to that survival, the DMN is no longer potentially helpful for that survival at those kind of very critical stages. And I think it's maybe this paradoxical, you know, sort of complete switch which happens. And I kind of, like I mentioned, there, you know, could be advantages for that, you know, but, you know, like with the life review, like having a life review, and there could be some like predictive processing things going on where you are trying to predict from all the repertoire of information that you have in your brain, how to potentially get out of this sort of threatening situation. But, you know, as to what could be doing that, like DMT, I think one of the most telling papers so far is that Lee paper in 2015, right? Like DMT could certainly have a role, but there's like so much happening in the brain at these sort of very critical physiological stages, like death. Yeah. So, you know, switching us for the purpose of survival, but you know, in that paper there was this idea of the corticocardiac signaling, which, you know, just mind blowing that it actually accelerates death eventually. So it's like this sort of whole organismic apoptosis, right? Programmed sort of death. And so that could be, you know, this idea of, you know, that could be part and parcel of what, you know, Rick's sort of getting at with his, you know, DMT acting as kind of reality thermostat. You know, who knows? Like, we don't know. Like, this is all sort of cutting edge sort of, you know, physiological research, but there, you know, I certainly am not, and you know, undermining any of these sort of transcendentalist interpretations, utterly open to those, love discussing of those. So maybe there is a thing which happens in the brain at death, which not just switches for our own survival, but switches for our transmigration, you know, elsewhere. I don't know. I was actually just listening to Andrew Gallimore's lecture series on psychedelic neuroscience, and he kind of has this idea about DMT has this very unique thing that happens in the brain where there's this reality model switching which goes on in the brain, right, at a certain point. And, you know, he kind of, you know, in his book, Alien Information Theory, you know, suggests that we then kind of access a new reality. But yeah, that was kind of a long-winded answer.
Thank you.
Amazing, thank you for that. We've got a question from Jacob as well. I'm going to unmute you now if you want to talk. Well, I don't seem to be able to unmute you, Jacob. Can you do it yourself?
Jacob? Can we hear you, Jacob? It's like Eurovision.
Yeah, Jacob, I'm going to ask your question for you, if that's okay, because I don't seem to be able to do it for you. Jacob asked, have there been past societies where DMT experiences were common/widespread? I wonder why it is illegal in most countries nowadays.
Past societies?
Yes.
Is that what you said? Where DMT was widespread? Don't know. You know, this kind of historical kind of scholarly work is not really my area. However, saying that, you know, it's incidental that I have just started reading The Immortality Key by Mirorescu, and just came out like the other week. And that's basically all about, you know, what I was saying with Gregory Shushan is he's sort of actually developing this idea, this brilliant idea that near-death experiences were the sort of ancient precursor for modern religions, really, religions as we have now. But then there was a sort of stages, you know, throughout all those millennia where people kind of realize this, like our ancestors realized that you have these transcendental experiences when you die, and as we are realizing now, but they didn't, like, may well be due to all these endogenous psychedelic activity happening. And so they would like bludgeon themselves with like sticks, and they'd like, you know, and that was like the beginning of shamanism. So shamanism, like subjecting yourself to similar physiological stress which you see at the point of death, can give rise to these transcendental experiences, right? Profoundly insightful experiences, which ended up being helpful for the community and stuff. And yeah, so this in the Immortality Key, it's sort of this new book, sort of dredging up all this evidence and actually physical evidence of like phytochemical kind of testing, to suggest that in the Elysian mysteries, like these ancient Greek sort of, you know, cult sort of mysteries, where they'd have these sort of transcendental experiences sort of like once a year, and it would like be the absolute fabric and glue for holding like society together. Those were psychedelic experiences. You know, Plato's forms, you know, his ideals were like, you know, these transcendent hyperdimensional, you know, geometrics, you know, you might see in like high dose psilocybin or like doing DMT experiences. But they're kind of suggesting that it was ergot, right? And I think there's so many ergoline alkaloids, but I think it was ergine or ergine, which is actually the one which is actually potently psychedelic. So it could be that they were using. So yeah, if you're interested in that kind of history of psychedelic uses in societies in a very, very, very different way that we have now, but maybe it's moving kind of closer toward that, and then read that book. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. We've got a question that isn't specifically related to your talk, but generally, whether you've got any advice for people applying for PhDs in the UK related to psychedelics. This is from Merv. I'm gonna unmute you if you've got anything to add to your question.
My bachelor science was chemistry, and I am studying behavioral neuroscience on the antidepressant effect of ketamine now, and I will be graduated in June in next summer. So, and I want to apply for a PhD on psychedelic studies, but I'm looking for them in UK or Europe, and I will be very appreciated if you can advise me on PhD applications or to search for open positions about this.
So where are you studying now?
In Turkey, Boğaziçi University.
And you're already studying ketamine?
Yes.
All right, cool. Well, you're pretty much there already, aren't you? So that's a really good position to be in, but you want to do a PhD in Europe or UK in psychedelics, in neuroscience, presumably. Yeah. I mean, I think, well, you're in an excellent position anyway. You know, I did a neuroscience degree, and I was told when I was getting into this by Tobias Bookborn, actually, who's at Imperial, like if you'd got neuroscience behind you, you're in an excellent position for psychedelic research anyway. I was doing it on omega oils, so like applying them to sort of rat neurites. Whereas if you're already using ketamine, then you're in a really good position already. But you know, I think my supervisor's already on here, so he actually could be be in a better position to say why it was that I got the position. I don't know, but I did just lots of research as to all the different people that I wanted to potentially work with. And then I emailed them all, just spammed them all. And David Luke was one of them. Had to email him quite a number of times. So, you know, persistence is number one. But also do a lot of kind of extracurricular reading. I mean, at least in my case, it was a pretty fringe thing because it was parapsychological as well. But obviously psychedelics is, you know, obviously somewhat fringe, but it's sort of coming more in the mainstream. But do a lot of your own extracurricular research to make sure that when you're coming to them, you've got a lot of understanding already, and you've already got the technical skills already if you're looking at the kind of neuroscience of ketamine. So yeah, I think you're in a good position. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Well, I hope that was useful to some other people as well. We've got a comment on the YouTube live stream, so I'm going to read it out. I think you did already touch on this, but maybe you could elaborate it on some more. The question is there a similarity in the NEDs between faiths, or do they vary with the religion of the protagonist?
Sorry, what was that? Can you repeat that?
Is there a similarity in the NEDs between faith, or do they vary with the religion of the protagonist? So
Oh, yeah.
Elaborate more on religion?
Yes, so, yeah, I mean, essentially what's found so far is that there's no difference in the incidence of near-death experiences, regardless of like what religion you are. If you're an atheist, if you're part of a religion. And that makes sense. I think like just the idea of having a near-death experience has got nothing to do with whether or not you have a belief or subscribe to a certain religion. However, the content of those experiences will be different. So that's, it's just really the same principle as what I was saying with DMT and near-death experiences, right? You got the same substructure, sort of fundamental structure, but between the two states, the content is quite vastly different. And that's the same with, if you're a Christian and been, brought up Christian, and someone who is brought up a Hindu, like in India, for instance. And so the content is different. Like you might see Chitragupta, the man with the book, who's the kind of sort of major arc god of Yamaloka, which is the afterworld of the Hindu kind of religion. And then, with Christian near-death experience, you'll see a sort of being of light, but you might interpret it as Jesus, so there are these content differences. So there's, if it was on the live stream, I know, but in a few months it'll be uploaded, and there's a particular quote from Shushan, and he sort of says, something very similar, because he's actually the one looking at differences between religions, really, but he's looking at it from kind of time scale perspective. So if you're interested, read this book. Can you see that? Right, there you go. Which is his book. So he does all of that. And Jeffrey Kripal is another comparative religious scholar as well. And he also looks at near-death experience. So if you're interested in the differences in religions with NDEs, then definitely check out those guys.
Sorry, could you read out the title of the book again?
Yes, sorry. Conceptions of the Afterlife and Early Civilizations. And then he also just brought out near-death experiences in indigenous religions.
Brilliant, thank you. I know, Gabrielle, you asked another question. I'm going to get back to you and let someone else ask a question first. Phoebe, I'm going to unmute you now if you want to ask your question.
Oh, hey, I wasn't expecting that.
Phoebe, what's up?
Thank you for a great presentation. It's really nice to get a deeper insight into what you're doing. I was really interested with the mythemes, am I saying that right?
Mm.
And these sound like archetypes to me. Is there a difference there, or how does that relate? And in your presentation, a lot of the experiences were of a sort of archetypal resonance, and I'm wondering how that fits in.
Yeah, I know you love your archetypes, so good question. Yeah, so I'm not 100%, so I haven't really looked into Levi Strauss just via Shushan. So the mythemes are kind of, yeah, I mean, they would be pretty similar to the archetypes. I mean, he actually had a tripartite thing, and he referred to them as structure, mytheme, and then Gregory Shushan imposed this idea of symbol. And so, yeah, Levi Strauss sort of said that the structure of the kind of text or experience that you're looking at would be the very kind of overarching thing, like otherworldly, like an otherworldly journey, like a near-death experience, right? So it's just like the actual body of the thing. And then the mytheme, all the different, it'll be structured into various mythemes, but they'll be kind of limited in number. There'll be the ascent, sense of seeing the corpse. This is at least in how Gregory Shushan looked at the different mythemes of ancient near-death experiences. And then encounter with another being, deceased relatives, ancestors, sense of unity or universal understanding and oneness. So these gross kind of structures, and they're like the mythemes, and they're you know, they would be archetypal. And then all the different archetypes would be manifested in very different ways in their symbols, right, in their different specific symbolic presentation. But yeah, I think just one thing, just why not to mention, because you know, I know you're really interested in archetypes, and sometimes we talk about kind of neuroscience perspective of it. And I think, you know, just reading into Andrew Gallimore and his sort of interest in DMT, that's, it might be a bit off tangent, but it might be interesting for other people as well. But you know, that he was saying that the theta activity in the brain really massively increases under the influence of DMT, and that's also this frequency of brain oscillations, which is associated with the dreaming state, and the dreaming state is understood to be exceptionally archetypal, right? Like that's, you know, Jung, Freud to discuss the archetypes in the context of like dream psychoanalysis and stuff. And so I think it's no wonder that you get highly archetypal content in the DMT state. Yeah, and so it's not really it's because theta is an oscillation which is associated with memory, right? Recall of memory. But this, because theta is a very slow wave, it sort of relates to deeper, older, ancient sort of areas of the brain. It could really be like this elicitation of very deep memories incorporated into deep in the body, i.e. archetypes. Yeah, so I just found that interesting and just recently, so I thought I'd share that.
Brilliant. Next, we're going to have a question from Helen. I hope I've said that right. I'm going to unmute you now.
Sorry, I'm just stuffing my face with brownie.
Jealous. Starving.
Thanks for a fascinating thought, Pascal.
All right.
When I've been listening to recent talks by others working in and around psychedelic phenomenology, I've noticed sometimes there's a distinguishing, I think I've seen James Cook do this recently, between a mystical experience that might be associated with ego dissolution and compounds like LSD or psilocybin, and a spiritual experience associated with compounds like DMT. Is this a separation categorization that you would go along with? And I've not had a DMT experience, and I've come across conflicting accounts of sense of self dissolving on DMT against other accounts where a sense of self and the ego are very much maintained despite the visions, and even without that feeling of sort of intoxication that you might sometimes get LSD or Shroom experience. So do you think this is a useful distinction? One that you make?
It's a really good question, because it's something, you know, I've thought about that a lot as well. So it is a correct observation in a way. But I wouldn't take it too far. Like it's really not like a one-to-one sort of differentiation. Like it's not like these other classical psychedelics, like, you know, LSD and psilocybin, like have this particular penchant for, like, you know, dissolving your ego completely, and compared to DMT, which in which your ego is fully preserved and you're in this otherworldly space. But as a sort of general thing, I mean, certainly that's something that, you know, Rich Strassman espoused, you know, because he was expecting these kind of peak mystical kind of experiences from his like Buddhist background, from looking at this endogenous psychedelic, and then actually found this, what he called like this very interactive relational phenomenology with DMT, which he was kind of surprised about. And that is different, obviously, to the, you know, what we're looking at is the dual and the non-dual experience, right? So he was expecting the kind of non-dual, and certainly do get that with the other psychedelics. And then, you know, actually DMT is pretty characterized by this dual experience. And, you know, I don't know, I think that's part of, but then, you know, high dose DMT is very dynamic, right? So it's this short acting experience, like it's literally like, and then it like kind of comes down just over the next few minutes. So I think at that like very peak, there's ego dissolution, but then at the kind of ensuing kind of couple of minutes are like when you are able to kind of come down, you get your bearings, you remember sort of something other than just you being like this sort of pure kind of point awareness, and then you can enter into the non-dual, and then have these interactions with these, you know, other beings and being in this other world. And you know, I think that's, yeah, part of this idea of the DMT, you know, what's sort of quintessential about DMT is this, and what's kind of baffling people like Gallimore, you know, and people at the moment, about how what psychedelics are supposed to do is they undermine your brain's ability to create this internal world model, right? So in the sense of psychedelics acting in the brain as in terms of the brain's predictive processing mechanisms, the brain's not any good at predicting the outside external world any longer, and so things become fluid and weird. And then actually, but with DMT, you kind of gets further than that, and that could be corresponding to this breakthrough experience where suddenly there is a new world, but it's not this world, but it's like a reconstructed world, which is suddenly a stable new world model, which isn't this consensus world model, and it isn't this world model which has been distorted. It's this sort of new world model. And so that new world model, that flip that occurs at the breakthrough, is related to potentially to this kind of transmission from the kind of dual, a non-dual, to the kind of dual. That's what I would say.
That's really helpful, thanks.
Great, and next I'm gonna actually let David Luke himself ask a question. Great that you're here today. And also fabulous that Rick's here with us as well. I'm going to, just in response to the chat, I'm going to say that if Rick, you do have a question that you'd like to bring up, indicate on the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to let Pascal have a look at the comments himself and the suggestions that have been made. But yeah, for now, David, if you have a question.
Yeah, I might pass on Rick's comment in a minute, but yeah, I had so many questions. Brilliant presentation, Pascal. So I think for me, one of the kind of major differences, and you've elucidated a lot of the others, is the lack of entoptics in NDEs, right? You don't get these geometric intense patterns, and that's almost a kind of total staple standard of DMT. And that kind of also then brings into question this idea, obviously in the mice data, you see this kind of 250-fold increase in serotonin, and you said serotonin is psychedelic, or at least it gives a head twitch response, but is it psychedelic in humans? And does it also induce this entoptic phenomena, which I don't think it does? And then moving on from that, the consideration of, well, given that these were actual death experiences with mice, is there a difference between an actual death and a near-death experience? And can we kind of translate one from the other precisely? So a few kind of questions rolled up there.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, with the geometric sort of fractal thing, obviously it's very quintessential with DMT, and it's not that common in near-death experience, but we've kind of had conversations already as well where there's where, you know, there are instances of near-death experiences where there are, you know, some kind of, you know, extra, you know, fascinating color displays kind of going on. Yeah, but I think this is part of, I think it would be an issue if we were kind of saying, is DMT the kind of major or the only sort of inducer of near-death experiences? Because obviously it can't be, because it's got this quintessential kaleidoscopic display thing, and you don't get that in near-death experiences, even though you might get like a little bit of like these interesting color patterns, right? Because I think there's so much more going on in the brain at near-death, which, you know, I think just at this stage is just such, you know, the research is in such infancy that it's hard to even just disentangle, you know, what's accounting for what. But yeah, that is, I think, it's certainly one phenomenological, you know, dimension which undermines the DMT is the major role, having a major role. But, you know, there could be, so if serotonin, for instance, as you say, has a big influence, and I kind of put my money there, then yeah, will it induce these patterns? But then obviously the patterns, I mean, you can have these theories, as you kind of sort of discuss about it being sort of hyperdimensional in some way. But a lot of it certainly is this sort of disinhibition of the occipital lobe to generate these kinds of patterns potentially. So that's something which which DMT does, but does serotonin? Would serotonin do that? Like, all we know at the moment as evidence for it being having a psychedelic effect is the mouse head twitch response, which is accrued by a behavioral marker for having a psychedelic experience. Or do rats have psychedelic experiences? Well, do they have near-death experiences? Who knows? Yeah, that's an open question still, isn't it? But yeah, the difference about actual death and near death, I think with cardiac arrest, like, it's interesting with cardiac arrest near death experiences, you go deeper. I think, and then in the Marshall study, they did actually find as well, which I didn't show, that they had near-death experiences from different etiologies, and those ones from cardiac arrest actually got much higher on the near-death experience scale. And interestingly, they were also closer to serotonin, to LSD and psilocybin experiences compared to just ketamine. So cardiac arrest were closer to these LSD and psilocybin experiences, which could, as I mentioned, psilocybin's a bit more similar to serotonin, which could be some kind of, maybe I'm clutching at straws here, I don't know, but like, it could be a kind of indicator of serotonin having kind of a better role in the near-death experience. And so, yeah, maybe in cardiac arrest, because it was indeed cardiac arrest which they're inducing in the rats, and so they're a kind of better model, but obviously they're different. Yeah, the brain state at death, you're looking at very many minutes into the brain state, and a lot of stuff is going to happen which isn't going to happen in the near-death state when you're only gone, for well, you still could be a couple of minutes in, so it still could be quite a lot, quite a big chunk of what's going on.
Just to chip in with Rick's kind of made a bit of a response here, saying that 5-hydroxytryptophan is converted to serotonin in mammals, but it's not psychedelic in humans. So maybe Rick can chip in on that. Rick also had maybe he wants to join in here. He had a really brilliant suggestion of giving DMT to people who've had near-death experiences, which I think you've got something to say about.
Yes, well, we're not giving DMT to anyone, but yes, but looking at people who've had near-death experiences and DMT experiences would be very interesting, and I think that's for different reasons, because I mean, on the surface of it, what's the kind of difference? Because you could just have what I'm doing, like, you're looking at population of people with DMT experience, population of people with near-death experience, comparing them as an analyst yourself. If you have, people with both of those experiences, you could just do the same. You could compare them, but you'd essentially be doing the same thing if they were outside of a person, within different people. But then you have the added advantage of them saying, well, they've got their own kind of sovereign, they're in a unique position to say, well, was it the same or not? And so that's very interesting. So you could certainly drill down as to what they feel about what the similarities and differences were. But I think what's most interesting about doing that is the idea that, is the idea that if you could ask them that if their experiences are, if their DMT trips, or if they've had multiple near-death experiences, like, happen to be really similar, like with every single progression, then you kind of could, suggest that if their DMT and near-death experiences are very similar, if DMT is involved in the NDE experience, you kind of like equate it. And so if those experiences are really similar, then that kind of is extra support for DMT being involved in the NDE. I don't know if that fully made sense, but it makes sense to me. So, but yeah, but let's just say that we're looking into that, Rick. So thanks for the suggestion, but we're kind of thank you. We're looking into it, and we'll feed back.
He's also got, he's made some comments of his own on that, actually. DMT.
I hope that, that when this Zoom closes, I'll be able to see all the chat of all these brilliant
Rick
comments.
says that some say they are similar and some say they're not. So
yeah,
that corroborates with what you found so far.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's fair enough. Yeah. And I think expectable as well. That's some are saying that it's very similar, and some are saying that it's quite vastly different. But I think the problem with that is that it's a very specific subsample, like because it's such a hard population, it's like hard to find population. So they'll so yeah, you don't have a lot of data to work with as to all the similarities and differences, and essentially, you basically just have one DMT trip and one NDE in one person and maybe a few other people. So you don't get the advantage of looking at a kind of vast array, because the issue is that they do differ so much, and so you could well end up with the situation in those few people where they like one person has one of those DMT trips which are really NDE like, and then one of those NDE trips which are really DMT like, and then you have another person which has one of those DMT trips which is nothing like near-death experiences. Do you know what I mean? So it gives this kind of very kind of mixed signals kind of thing.
Amazing. We should be wrapping up soon, but we've got another couple of questions, Pascal. Would you like to answer them, or should we call that?
No, if people are cool with going, I'm kind of feeling like I'm losing my head a bit, but I'd be absolutely happy to keep going.
Yeah, okay, let's do two more, and then
it's no problem.
We're going to call it a day. Gabriella, did you have another question that you wanted to ask earlier on? I've unmuted you now, hopefully.
I think in your one you mentioned, what was it? Sorry, I didn't find what you mentioned about precognitive or like prophetic death with near-death experiences, which you just mentioned on the slide. Can you talk a bit more about what you meant by that?
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I find because there's really not enough of this experimental data with experimental research with the idea of parapsychology and extrasensory perception being a thing. And I find, a lot of what I've discussed, can really be, that's why I made sure to have that kind of ontological slide at the end to really keep doors open, because a lot of what I said can be construed as being quite, well, it's quite biological in a lot of ways. But I find, to kind of dismiss the near-death experience is not transcendental objective, and actually it's internally generated kind of experience. So that's why I find these different parapsychological concomitants to NDE so fascinating, because they could really potentially be this extra lock, to kind of think about it and elucidate it. So yeah, so precognition, yeah. I mean, Jeffrey Kripal was a religious scholar I just mentioned, and he's just written "Changed in a Flash." There you go. Changed in a Flash. And in that, he kind of co-writes it with this woman who had this near-death experience induced by a flash of lightning, hence the name. And she was plagued with precognitive dreams after that. So, this idea, I think you were kind of asking earlier about, the opening of the kind of valve, as it were, the Huxleyan reducing valve, right? And so, yeah, her lightning strike kind of might have induced all of these things which happen in the mammalian brain at this point of like near death, potentially involving his endogenous psychedelics, and like really opening up her doors of perception, right? These neural doors of perception. And she had these really, which were corroborated, these precognitive dreams afterward. But you get these things happening in the near death experience in and of itself. And there's one interesting thing called, well, first of all, prophetic near-death experiences was a big. Have I got that book here as well? I'll stop showing you my near-death experience books, but it's there. It's Kenneth Ring again, and he had this thing called the Omega Project, and he spoke at length about near-death experiences having prophetic dreams, prophetic visions within the near-death experience, and but that he was writing in the 80s, and there was kind of like the Cold War, and like people were thinking, so there seems to be this apparently prophetic element, but as they still seem to be, even if they're like corroborated somehow, still seem to be colored or conditioned by the kind of zeitgeist, because a lot of their precognitive dreams are about, you know, severe like depopulation and, you know, and like climatological catastrophe and stuff like that. But they kind of said that it would happen like imminently, like literally anytime now, you know, like in the next few years. And obviously that hasn't happened. But, you know, one thing is that I think we can all, like, I think that the idea of it being having to get the temporal kind of period correct is sort of not here nor there. It's if it happens kind of to a significant similar degree is what they described. But yeah, so he spoke about that in the Omega Project, and the yeah, and there's another thing called Pekin Darien experiences. Bit of a weird name, but Pekin Darien refers to when the kind of conquistadores were coming up the Chilean, I think, the Andean mountains, and they were expecting to see another continent on the other side, and they actually just saw the ocean, and that peak was called, it was in the area of Darien, and so this is the idea of something like completely surprising. I think that's where the derivation of it was, like something completely surprising happening. And that's a phenomenon where in near-death experiences, someone's dying and they actually they have this classic encounter with the deceased relatives, but they didn't know that they were dead. Like they had absolutely no idea that they died, perhaps because they literally just died at the same moment. So it's a kind of ridiculous kind of shared death experience where both of them are kind of in that near-death state, or they could have just died like, you know, some time beforehand, but they still had no idea about that. So, you know, this is a thing called super psi. You know, it's this problem where it could well be, in the sort of survivalist sense, you're going to the same transliminal state in which, you know, your dead relatives have gone and they're meeting you there, or it could be psi, like extrasensory perception, right? And it kind of reduces that, like it's as if that's a reduction. Like it's pretty cool that extrasensory perception can happen in and of itself, and certainly suggests some kind of non-local activity of consciousness, but it, you know, it might not necessarily imply this you know, actual kind of other world happening after death. So yeah, there's some thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you think you're up to answering one more question, or would you like to leave it there?
Well, let's see. If I keel over halfway, then, you know, just shout at me. No, it's all good.
Love, I'm gonna unmute you now. Do you think you could maybe pick one of your two questions, and then we'll leave it there? You should be unmuted now.
I wondered about the combination of different neurotransmitters which are released during initiated NDEs and during the release of endogenous DMT.
During the different neurotransmitters released during when?
For example, can we say that different combinations of neurotransmitters are released during initiated NDEs and during endogenous and during natural NDEs? And can we say that the differences in the experiences due to this different combination of neurotransmitters?
Right, yeah. Yeah, I don't know, that's a really, really good question. A very good neuroscientific question. Yeah, so by initiated near-death experiences, you're kind of referring to the NDE-like experiences that I mentioned. So I'm doing that a lot, aren't I? Let's put them away. So like meditation, dreams, hypnosis, those kind of initiated near-death experiences. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Well, so dreams and yeah, meditation. I'm not sure about specific like combinations of neurotransmitters, but, you know, at least from first principles, if the phenomenology is very similar, then, you know, to actual near-death experiences, then, you know, presumably there is, you know, at least sufficiently similar like neurotransmitter systems going on. I mean, the difficulty with that, obviously, I mean, I think with the fear death experiences, I mean, it's not really initiated ones that you're kind of referring to, but again, like all of this research is such in its infancy, especially the neuroscience of it. So, you know, you're in a good, you know, going good direction. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to think if the experiences are so similar, fear death experiences and actual near-death experiences, when in actual near-death experiences there's all this, you know, metabolic neurotransmitter activity that I was saying, which is induced by this physiological insult and, you know, the stress, but you don't have that obviously in the fear death, you know, kind of anticipatory near-death experiences, and yet the experiences can be actually so similar. What's accounting for that? I think, but you know, I was kind of, with all of this qualitative analysis, I'm trying to improve on the DMT models near-death experience paper, because they just looked at the items, which are very, very crude, and so that's also the scale that was used for the comparison of the NDE-like experiences and the classic near-death experiences. And so I think certainly, and I hopefully will do it at some point, if you were to look in the same way that I've done here, like in a qualitative sense, then the experiences of, you know, anticipatory death experiences will be pretty different actually, to ones that you get in like the throes of cardiac arrest. So I'd say that there is all these, you know, neurotransmitter systems sort of going off, sort of popping away in the classic NDEs, but then, you know, in these anticipatory death experiences, there won't be, and therefore there'll be quite dissimilar kind of actual qualitative content to what's going on. But then, you know, there's things like the very, very first systematic, well, one of the first systematic studies of near-death experiences was in the 1800s, and the names completely escape me. But Albert Heim, and so that was a fear-death experience. He was falling from, he was an alpine climber, and he fell from a height, and you know, he's having this experience while he's falling, but yeah, you'd have to look into the specific content of the experiences. So I'd imagine that it's, you know, as a neuroscientist, you'd have to look at these very, very nuanced levels of like what neurotransmitters can act at such speed, and so like glutamate, for instance, is the fast excitatory neurotransmitter. And that's interesting because that could happen in such, you know, short time spaces. And ketamine, like I mentioned, and you're looking at ketamine, so maybe this could be your new research project. Brilliant. You know, ketamine increases cortical glutamate. So, but the problem with that is that we don't actually have ketamine in the brain, and there's only some theorized ketamine-like chemicals which could induce near-death experiences which are endogenous in the brain, like magnesium and agmatine and something else, NAG. But then they haven't stood up to the rigorous testing as like DMT has, because DMT has been found in the dying mammal brain, whereas these things haven't yet. But they haven't been looked for. So.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Brilliant. You've carried on for an impressively long time there, Pascal. We really, really appreciate you going into all those extensions and sharing your work and time. And thank you everyone for coming here today and learning and enjoying something from our events this term. I'm wishing everyone a fabulous Christmas, and we'll be running events again next year in January. So thank you very much, and see you next time.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Clara and the Society. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Amazing.
Pascal. That was
Thank
brilliant.
you.
Cheers. Take care, everyone.